Clearly, I think there's areas in which they could have done better. To be fair to the Trudeau government, governments around the world, particularly democratic governments, have struggled to manage this pandemic, and governments around the world have had successes and failures in their management of the pandemic, and the Trudeau government is no different in that regard. I do think they've made a number of mistakes that we're now bearing the consequences of. I think they were late in negotiating the 7 vaccine contracts, and the terms of those contracts were not as strong as they should have been. So as a result, we're behind on vaccination procurement and delivery this quarter and potentially next quarter. And so we lag the vaccination rates of those of the United Kingdom and the United States. And so that's one area in which I think the government should have done and could do a better job. It's hard for us to be definitive about where the mistake happened because the government has yet to release the text of the 7 vaccine contracts. And so this information has come out in dribs and drabs over the last several months. It was only last week that we found out from the government that the terms of the contract delivery, the terms of the delivery of vaccines in the contract is quarterly, not monthly or weekly. So we're flying somewhat blind because the government hasn't been forthcoming with information, particularly the text of the contracts.
We'll go back to the current administration and Justin Trudeau a little later. I first wanted to get a better understanding of your experience working in the Stephen Harper administration, and in particular as part of his cabinet.
Yeah, I thought I served as a minister in the cabinet. I also served as a backbencher. I also chaired parliamentary committees during that time. And so I had a wide exposure to the different aspects of that time, Harper's time in government. My experience was that they ran a very tight ship, that the government was well managed, that the PMO and ministers' offices were well managed, and that the government was good at executing its decisions. And I think that's a lesson the current government could learn from. I think there's been a lot of well-intentioned announcements from the current government, but I think there could be a stronger, better management of execution. So that's the one thing I took away from my time during the Harper government years. The other thing I took away is that the execution of decisions is incredibly important. I think the way Canada managed its way out of the global financial crisis of 2008 demonstrates that. Canada did better than any other G7 country in many respects. And I think that was based on largely the ability to execute decisions that were taken in 2009.
For a lot of our viewers here in the UK, I wanted to discuss a little bit about yourself, Michael Chong, as a Conservative. I think if you were British, you'd fairly easily be a part of the Conservative Party in the UK. Now, one of the issues Conservatives in this country face is the ability to show people that, yes, you may believe in conservative economics and conservative fiscal policies, but you can also be fairly socially liberal too. I would classify yourself as someone who's falls into that category, and definitely as someone who's progressive. So my question to you is, how do you explain that to the public, as being a Conservative can often come with a bit of stigma for being a bit more aggressive?
Yeah, what I tell the members of the public is that we have a proud tradition in the Conservative Party. The Canadian Conservative Party has been a party of many firsts. In fact, under Prime Minister John Diefenbaker in the 1950s, the first female cabinet minister was appointed not just in Canada, but in the entire Commonwealth. Her name was Ellen Fairclough. She was from the Hamilton, Ontario area, and she was appointed to the federal cabinet, the very first woman. Another first was the election of a Canadian of Chinese descent, Douglas Jung, in the early 1960s, the very first Canadian of Chinese descent, elected as a Conservative, elected to the House of Commons. The first Black Canadian was elected to the House of Commons at Lincoln Alexander, who was a Conservative. He was the very first Black cabinet minister appointed in 1979, 1980. So we are a party of many firsts, and we should be proud of that. That said, I believe that we have to do better in reaching out to new Canadians, to ethno-cultural communities, in order to grow the party. Canada's demographics are rapidly changing, and our party needs to reflect the diversity of this country today. So we have a proud history, and we have lots of room to grow, and I'm part of the effort to grow the party in its space. And I think we have things that we can learn from the UK Conservative Party to do that. I think the UK Conservatives have done a good job on issues like climate change, which appeal to a younger generation of voters, something that I've long admired and something that I think Canadian Conservatives can learn from.
It's interesting, you talked about diversity there, and one of the big issues that we talk about a lot on this platform in UK media is immigration. Now, in the UK, as we move on from the European Union, we have the opportunity to set our own immigration policy. Canada's immigration points-based policy has often been admired in the UK, and there are reports that we may move to something similar. I want to start by initially asking your general thoughts on immigration in Canada. And do you think the UK would be wise in adopting a similar kind of system?
Well, I'll leave that decision for the UK government, but I think there's lessons that can be learned from the Canadian system. I think our system has been a very good system, and there has been a bipartisan consensus in Canada on the issue of immigration, in a similar way that there's been a bipartisan consensus in the UK on climate change. The key characteristics of our immigration system, as you pointed out, is that it is based on a points system, but more broadly, the key elements are that it is a controlled immigration system where we decide who is admissible into the country, and it is a system based on legal immigration. And so as a result of that controlled legal immigration to Canada over many decades, we've built an enormous amount of public support and bipartisan support for our system. And I think that's different than many other countries around the world where immigration is a very polarized debate. And there are people who are very divided on the issue. I think we've managed to avoid that in Canada because of those key characteristics of a point system that ensures this legal, safe, and orderly system.
A thing that I actually watched you do last week was the discussion in the House of Commons between the economic relationship between Canada and the United States of America. You discussed a lot about the USA becoming more protectionist in recent years, and you pointed out something that probably a lot of people have missed, which was this has been a trend in America long before the Trump administration, and you cited some of the decisions made by Obama showing that. I was hoping if you could explain more about that to our audience, and also how some of Joe Biden's executive orders even have made an immediate impact on Canada.
Well, thank you, Sunil, for the question. That's a great question. The largest two-way trading relationship in the world is the Canada-United States trading relationship. Particularly for Canada, there is no trading relationship more important. 1/5 of our entire economy is exports to the United States. In other words, 1/5 of our economic output each and every year is bound for exports to the United States. And so the United States by far and away is our most important trading partner. So over the years, that relationship has expanded. To give you a bit of a historical sweep of this, we had a fairly closed economy for much of our history. The country's, the first Prime Minister after Confederation in 1867 implemented what was called a national policy. It was a policy of a high tariff wall around the country to prevent the import of American goods. And that policy was in place for many, many decades. And we developed an emerging manufacturing industry here and other domestic industries as a result of that. But by the 1980s, it became clear that that was no longer tenable. And the reason was quite simple. Canada is a vast geography, and we produce a lot more things than we can consume. We've always produced far more wheat, barley, soybeans, corn, and other foodstuffs than we could ever possibly consume. And as we headed into the 1980s, we produced far more automobiles and other manufactured products than we could ever consume. And so as a result, we've always had a need to export. And it became increasingly clear that this high tariff wall was an impediment to doing that. And so in the 1988 election, Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney campaigned on a remarkable change for the country, which was to embrace free trade with the United States. He won that election, and subsequently, there's been a bipartisan consensus in Canada that free trade has been good for this country. And in the years after 1988, free trade with America expanded rapidly to the point where 1/5 of all our economic output is bound for exports to the United States. What has changed in the last 10 years is an increasing American protectionism that is threatening those exports. It started with President Obama and the Buy American provisions that were put in place during his administration. It continued with his decision to nix Keystone XL, which would have exported Canadian oil to the United States, and it continues to this day. And so our view is that we need to, the onus is on us as Canadians to think about how we can protect that trading relationship and ensure that our exports can continue to flow to the United States. And the reason why is this. While 1/5 of all our exports, 1/5 of all our economic output is destined for the United States, that is not true in reverse. Fewer than 2% of the American economy is destined for exports to Canada. So it's a very asymmetrical trading relationship. And as a result, the onus really is on us to think through how we can protect that trading relationship, if not expand it.
Another country that's obviously going to be a huge talking point for Canada, not just Canada, the globe, is China. We've had regular discussions on this platform on China and the CCP in particular. And you released a statement actually urging Canada to officially condemn the treatment of the Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups. The statement was along the lines of these acts of genocide include systemic population control, sexual violence, and mass detention. Now, my understanding is that you're going to be filing a motion that describes this as genocide to the House of Commons at the earliest opportunity. Going forward, how does Canada deal with China and the CCP?
Well, thanks, Sunil, for the question. It's an important one. Genocide is a word that we shouldn't use lightly. And it's clear that through a number of credible reports now that there is a genocide taking place. Our view is that the government needs to work with our allies to develop a comprehensive response to that finding. We're calling on the Liberal government, the Trudeau government, to first come to that conclusion, because there is, we believe, sufficient evidence to conclude that. We call on them to work with allies to facilitate other countries' recognition of this fact. And we're calling on them to work closely with allies like the United Kingdom and the United States to take collective action to stop this gross violation of human rights. And so that's, we're going to look for opportunities to advance this debate in the House of Commons this spring. And it's something that the world cannot turn a blind eye to. You know, it was only 75 years ago that the Second World War had ended and that we pledged never again to another genocide, which was the Holocaust. And, you know, in Rwanda in the 1990s, the development of the doctrine of responsibility to protect was promulgated. And here we are today, faced with with evidence of another genocide taking place. So we have a responsibility to act. Canada is not a superpower, and so we cannot act unilaterally. We have to act collectively with our allies.
It's interesting talking about China. You know, we've had a lot of talk on here that the commonwealth with countries such as India and other countries in particular in Asia potentially offering some offset on some of the reliance that we in the UK and many other countries have on China. Is that something that you believe that could help tackle China and the CCP with both Canada and UK facing this issue? Because one of the other things that we've had from other politicians on this platform is there is an issue when tackling China, the fact that it's almost against our financial incentives to start to go down this route of either punishing them or going into any sort of conflict.
Well, I think that's a very good point. China is not the Soviet Union of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was very isolated from Western democracies, from the Western Alliance. There weren't a lot of exchanges of people. The borders were pretty sealed, going in both directions. There wasn't a lot of investment, two-way investment that took place, and there wasn't a lot of trade between the Western Alliance and the Soviet bloc. And so how the Western Alliance dealt with the Soviet Union needs to be viewed in that context. China is different. China is not only a superpower, but an integrated part of the global economy. And so the reality is that we can't take the same approaches to China as we once took with the Soviet Union. And so to that end, I believe that there are certain things that we need to take a different approach on in order to secure the safety and security of our citizens. And I think when it comes to personal protective equipment, vaccines, medical supplies, clearly we don't want to be reliant on a partner that may block the export of those products and thus endanger the safety and security of our citizens. But on the other hand, it's not practical to suggest that we're going to completely cut off all trade and investment with China. I think we have to take a smart approach on this. And what we have to do really is work in concert with our allies and identify areas where we can work collectively to put pressure on China to change its ways. When it relates to things like the international rules-based system, when it comes to respect for decisions made by multilateral organizations, and when it comes to the threats that they're posing to our citizens and to our interests, and when it comes to the threats that they're posing to human rights and the violations of human rights law that we're seeing in Western China.
Another speech of yours that I saw last year, which is more than relevant right now, was on the importance of freedom of speech. I think at the time the Liberal Party government panel had proposed to regulate all commercial internet content. And now we're hearing more reports and suggestions that Justin Trudeau may be in favor of further regulation on freedom of speech on the internet. It's been a huge talking point in the UK, with Twitter banning Donald Trump, and many almost opposed that sort of censorship. Is censorship and over-regulation on freedom of speech a concern for you?
Yes, it is a concern. Let me be the first to say that, my record and, my actions demonstrate that I'll be the first to denounce hate speech and denounce odious, xenophobic, and racist viewpoints. That said, I strongly believe in freedom of expression as a fundamental right. It's a right that is particularly strong in democracies like the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, democracies like Australia and New Zealand. And I think we have to protect that right. Obviously, free expression is not an unlimited right. There've long been limits on expression, but they've been de minimis limits, and rightfully so, because it's allowed for free debate and the robust clash of ideas that we've seen. I think the challenge that we're facing today is the rapid emergence and dominance of social media platforms as a platform for expression. And I think the two fundamental questions that we need to tackle are, first, are these platforms simply private domains where the owners can make editorial decisions about what gets carried on their platforms or not? Or are they so dominant now and so oligopolistic or even monopolistic that they effectively shut down expression in the public square? So the first question really is one that revolves around whether or not they've become too monopolistic, and whether or not preventing somebody from expressing themselves on these platforms effectively shuts them out from the public square. The remedies for that, could be range from, looking at breaking up these monopolies, like the United States did when it decided to break up AT&T in the 1980s and turn it into a number of baby bells, to mandating that they have an obligation to carry free expression. The second question is, if we're going to allow, the second question that's related is whether or not there is a right to be hosted by web hosting companies, like Amazon Web Hosting Services. There is an argument that some have made that web hosting companies like Amazon Web Hosting Services are effectively a printing press. And like we don't ban the printing press, we shouldn't be banning a modern version of that printing press in the form of a web hosting company refusing to host a website or a platform. So those are two questions, I think, that have to be debated. And the answers to those questions, I think, should largely be informed on our principles of free expression.
Another big debate that goes on in this country is the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, a bit of a mouthful, otherwise known as the CPTPP. And in the last couple of weeks, the UK has announced it will be applying to join the free trade agreement. Canada are, of course, already part of the agreement. What are your thoughts on the trade agreement, and do you think it's a wise move for the UK to join?
Well, my thoughts are that these trade agreements are good things for countries to join. The difficulty is always in the negotiation of the details of what is to be given up on either side. But as a conservative, I believe in free markets. I believe that liberalizing trade and investment is mutually beneficial to both sides of an agreement like this one. So I'm encouraged that the UK has indicated interest in joining this agreement, and I'm hopeful that the agreement can be expanded to include the United Kingdom. I would add that I'm also hopeful that the United States will take a second look at entering the CPTPP. They were originally party to this agreement, but they have since withdrawn. I'm hopeful that at some point in the next several years that the United States will look to join this agreement. I think strengthening trade and investment ties amongst democracies is one way to counter the increasing authoritarianism that we're seeing in the world. I think one of the conclusions that I've come to is that we made two broad assumptions after the fall of the Berlin Wall. One of those assumptions, I think, was and is correct. The other, I think, was incorrect. The first assumption that was correct was that by liberalizing trade and investment, that we could mutually benefit countries and societies on both sides of those trade and investment agreements. And I think that's happened. I think it's clear that in the last 20, 30 years that hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, in large part because of liberalization. But our second assumption, I think, was the one that has proven to be flawed. And that second assumption was that by liberalizing trade and investment with authoritarian regimes, that we would naturally and organically bring them more into the international rules-based system and strengthen their records on human rights, the rule of law, and to a certain extent, democratic institutions. But I think that assumption is clearly proven to be wrong. In fact, I think what has happened is that many of these authoritarian regimes have used their newfound wealth and prosperity to reinforce their authoritarian tendencies, creating surveillance states and detention states and committing human rights violations and upending not just not just the domestic principle of rule of law, but increasingly the international principle of the rule of law.
When we're talking of trade, it's hard not to mention that the CANS UK. It's something we've had a lot of questions on this platform today and for yourself. And it's interesting that your party has adopted support for CANS UK as one of its official positions. I understand the rationale is that the CANS UK is all four nations have advanced economies, shared culture, and heavily interwoven history. The CANS UK proposal has attracted a surge of interest in the UK over the past few years as Britain's relationship with the EU becomes more distant. And last year, a group of Conservative, Labour, and Liberal Democrat MPs created the all-party parliamentary group for CANS UK in the House of Parliament. And according to research, the CANS UK proposal is very popular amongst all age groups, especially in the young. What do you see the future for CANS UK, and do you believe it can form its own trade bloc?
Well, I think there's lots of opportunities for the exploration of this idea of this trading bloc. I think a lot of the trade questions will be settled through the CPTPP mechanism for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and will be settled through, the eventual negotiation of a permanent Canada-United Kingdom trade agreement. But the relationship is so much more than just an exchange of merchandise, goods, and exports. There's areas in which we can much more closely cooperate in terms of expanding labor mobility, in terms of looking at collaboration on standards, and looking at closer collaboration on security and intelligence matters, as well as military and other security cooperation. So I think, I think that there's a lot of merit to this idea, particularly as it relates to areas outside of trade, which I think will be largely settled by the Canada-UK trade agreements and has been settled through the CPTPP. So to me, it's more of a collaboration that could come from an agreement that touches on areas outside of merchandise exports.
We'll go back to sort of foreign affairs questions shortly, but I wanted to focus on some domestic Canadian issues, if you like. I want to start with, what do you think some of the long-term challenges are facing the Conservative Party of Canada? You know, we saw 9 years of the Stephen Harper administration from 2006 to 2015, but now we've had 6 years of the Justin Trudeau Liberal Party. How does the Conservative Party of Canada start to look at winning a majority? As last election, you know, the party did begin to close the gap with Justin Trudeau losing his majority.
Yeah, I think we have to grow the appeal of our party to new demographics that have been previously unreached. I think of younger voters who voted largely for the Liberal Party in the last election. I think of women who largely voted Liberal in the last election. And I think of ethnocultural communities. And so those are three key demographics that we need to win over. And I think that means that we have to come forward with real policies to combat climate change based on conservative principles. I think we need to make it clear that we are Canadian conservatives from a very different conservative tradition than our friends south of the border. And so, I mean, I think that means clearly stating that in our tradition, we welcome Canadians of all races, all religions, all creeds. Our record demonstrates that. Our front bench demonstrates that, and our leader, Aaron O'Toole, has demonstrated that. And I think it means speaking to the very real economic concerns coming out of this pandemic that many families have, particularly women, particularly single mothers, and those who have been disadvantaged by the restrictions brought on by this pandemic. And so my view is, Aaron O'Toole's view is that by speaking to these groups that we can help broaden the base of the party and address one of the key challenges that we're facing.
Do you think it's almost a bit of a branding issue? It's interesting you brought the men and women aspect in voting. I saw some data recently that showed the Conservative Party beating the Liberal Party in every age group for males, but losing every single one for females. And the gap was quite significant. So do you think, because you've mentioned at the start of this webinar, and the stats and the facts speak for themselves in terms of how well the Conservative Party Canada have done in terms of being ethnically diverse. So do you think it's potentially a branding issue or something different?
Yeah, I think it's. I think we have to do a better job of proposing policies, proposing initiatives that speak to the concerns of these groups. I'll give you one example. It's clear that during this recession of the last year, that women, particularly single working women, single mothers, were hard hit by this recession. And so that's one reason why we've proposed that the Canada Child Benefit be enhanced. It's a benefit that's paid to parents of children, particularly lower income families that help them. And we think by enhancing this benefit, we can help address one of the very real concerns from that group of voters. So these are the kinds of things we're talking about in order to do a better job of winning the support of women, of younger voters, and of working families.
That said, how do you feel Justin Trudeau's fared as the country Prime Minister? In the UK, we don't often get that much coverage of Canadian news. I think we often see maybe the scandals he's been involved in, but in terms of his time as Prime Minister, how do you think he's fared?
Well, it's hard to say. I'll leave the long-term definitive assessment of his legacy to historians. And it's clearly being head of government is a difficult job. But I will say that there is a sense that he has been disappointing on many levels. When I think of foreign policy, he came to office with a number of very big commitments commitments that the government has failed to deliver on. Just several come to mind. There was the famous "Canada is back" message that he delivered to the world when he first took office. We had the second vote for a UN Security Council seat last June. We lost that vote, but the important detail was that Canada lost that vote for the second time in 10 years last June, with 6 fewer votes than Canada had obtained in 2010. That's a quantifiable indictment of the government's foreign policy. It's quantifiable indictment of 6 countries saying that Canada is no longer the leader that it once was, even 10 years ago. And so that's one example. The more larger examples are the government came to office promising to do much better on climate change. And for each and every year for which the government has released the official data, Canada's emissions have risen. In the first full year of its office in power in 2016, Canada's emissions stood at 708 megatons. In 2018, the last year for which we have official data, emissions have risen to 729 megatons, a 21 megaton jump in emissions when we're supposed to be going in the opposite direction. So we are not on track to meeting our Paris commitments. We didn't meet the Copenhagen commitments that were to have been obtained last December, just several weeks ago. And so again, another example of a huge gap between rhetoric and reality. And a third and final example is that the government came to office promising to take a leadership role on the world stage in helping the poorest. The fact is that Canada's foreign aid contribution has fallen in the last 5 years. It averaged between 2005 roughly and 2015. It averaged about 0.3% of gross national income under the previous government, and it's currently averaged 0.27% under the current government. That's a 10% cut in foreign aid. And so again, a yawning gap between rhetoric and reality. So I think there is a general consensus that the government has been disappointing in many respects, and that there's been too great a gap between its rhetoric and what it has delivered on.
It's interesting you mentioned about climate change. I remember not too long ago, you were one of the first, almost most prominent Conservative Party of Canada members who really spoke out and on climate change and wanted to make a clear difference and for it to be an issue taken seriously. Do you think the Conservative Party of Canada today offers better solutions on climate change than what Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party are doing?
Well, I think we will offer better solutions. We've yet to formulate our policy for our manifesto, for our platform. That will be coming out in the next election campaign, whenever that will take place. So I think I'm confident that it will be a good policy on climate change, because there is a consensus in the Conservative Party that one of the reasons why we didn't win the last election was because our policy wasn't credible enough with voters. And so I think there's a big initiative internally to rethink how we approach this issue, to ensure that we come forward with a credible policy that voters will support in the next election.
It's interesting you mentioned next election. There's been a lot of talk of Justin Trudeau calling an early election this year rather than waiting for 2023. Many people are viewing a slight improvement in his approval ratings. The fact that he only has a minority government as reasons for him to call an election, and the cabinet reshuffle last month further hinted for many as proof that an election in 2021 is more than possible. What are your thoughts on this, and how would the Conservative Party of Canada react to the prospects of an early election?
Well, let me answer the second part of that question first, which is that we're ready for an election whenever it's called. Our party is operationally ready. It's also financially ready. In fact, we've raised more money in the last several quarters than any other party. And in some cases, most money we've ever raised in our party's history. So we're ready to go if and when there is an election. That said, I think it would be highly irresponsible of the Prime Minister to trigger an election in the middle of a pandemic. The country is struggling to overcome the second wave of spread of COVID-19. And I think the Prime Minister would be doing something very irresponsible by triggering a federal election in the middle of this second wave of the pandemic. I think we need to get through the pandemic before we have an election. And I don't think the Prime Minister should put his own self-interest ahead of the lives and livelihoods of Canadians.
It wouldn't be a Conservative Friends of Commonwealth event if we didn't ask your thoughts on the Commonwealth today and the role it can play in the future.
Well, the Commonwealth is an association of more than 4 countries with historic links to each other and to the United Kingdom. Billions of people live in countries that are members of the Commonwealth. And so I think it's an important multilateral institution that, like the Francophonie, we should be working with in order to protect our interests and to defend and project our values around the world. And so Conservatives believe that in re-engaging in a deeper way in the Commonwealth in order to accomplish that. I think multilateral organizations have become increasingly important in the last number of years, particularly because of the rise of authoritarianism. I think it's clear that small to mid-sized countries have been increasingly used as piñatas in, global game of great power conflict. And so in that context, strengthening and renewing multilateral institutions like the Commonwealth, I think should be a key foreign policy priority of the Canadian government. I think of the Commonwealth as an organization that is like the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, and many other multilateral organizations that in recent years has not been as effective as it might be. And I think that Canada could play a leading role working with the United Kingdom in strengthening the Commonwealth's role in helping to defend our own individual interests, but also to defend the collective values that we believe in. Principles, values such as a belief in liberty, a belief in democratic institutions, and a belief in the rule of law.
You touched on there a bit about authoritarian regimes at the moment. How do you feel about democracy currently? You rightly pointed out, almost since the Berlin Wall, there was this almost acceptance of liberal democracy almost going across the globe, and it didn't quite happen. What do you think of the state of democracy right now? Because there's a lot of reports that are saying democracy in the last 4 to 5 years in particular has started to decline, and people are moving away from democratic structures. Is that something that concerns you?
It does concern me. So it's clear that through the quantitative measures undertaken by various think tanks that democracies have been back on their heel in the last several years. And a lot of these indices, you can see the decline in democratic outcomes, democratic institutions in a variety of countries. It's clear that that in the last decade, that has been the case. That said, I believe in the principles of democracy, the idea of that power shouldn't be concentrated in any one place, that there should be a series of checks and balances on power, and that there should be democratic input into who the rulers are through fair and free elections. And on that, I'm confident about the state of democracy. At the at the end of the day, it's these democratic principles that we have to be confident in. And history demonstrates that the actualization of those principles hasn't always been a linearly smooth and upward trajectory. You think about the early days of the threats to democracy in World War II, in the Second World War, where democracies were shambolic in their approach to the fascism threat and authoritarianism that we saw both in the Far East and in continental Europe. I read a book recently, and in the early days of the Battle of Britain, the RAF couldn't come up with a tally of how many Spitfires it had, and it took them months, and they still had two different tallies. They couldn't come up. We had virtually no standing military in Canada or the United States in the early days of that war. We were completely taken by surprise, and our response demonstrated that. And in the early years of that war, it wasn't clear. It looked like the forces of Nazism and totalitarianism were going to triumph. But we eventually got our act together, and we eventually prevailed, and we all know what the outcome of that was. And so I think, while it's not exactly the same situation we're facing today, there are parallels. And the parallels are that democracies are once again back on their heels. If you look at recent years and the threats that democracies have faced from rising authoritarianism, that's clearly the case. If you look at even how many Western democracies handled the early stages in response to this pandemic, we didn't look as good as many authoritarian states. But I'm confident that we will eventually get it right. And I think the recent vaccination rates in the United Kingdom and the United States are demonstrations of that. So in the long run, I think the most crucial thing that we have to do is to be confident about the principles that our societies are based on. These are timeless principles that laid the foundation of hundreds of years of democratic evolution. And if we remain confident about the cogency and the veracity of these principles, I'm confident that we will eventually get this right.
The final question from me before we take a couple from the audience. Let's say hypothetically, the election is called and the Conservative Party gets an overwhelming majority, and you're stated as the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What would be your sort of top priority or almost an action plan, aside from obviously pushing forward the Commonwealth?
Yeah, I think our number one foreign policy challenge today is China. And I think we need a new framework on China that allows us to take a much stronger stand in defense of our values and in defense of our interests. As you know, we have two Canadians who've been wrongfully jailed, Mr. Coburg and Mr. Spaver. We have another Canadian who's been in long time detention, Mr. Hussein Jalil. And we have yet another Canadian who has been arbitrarily put on death row, Mr. Schellenberg. And so that, combined with the threats to Canadian companies, our canola farmers, our beef and pork farmers, it's clear that China is our greatest challenge. And so a Conservative government would come forward with a new framework on China that would guide our decision-making in response to these threats. I think clearly the biggest, most important foreign trade relationship that we have is with the United States. And so, we would work to ensure that relationship remains strong in the face of increasing protectionism. And finally, as you mentioned, we want to work multilaterally to strengthen our ties, both within the Commonwealth and with partners like the United Kingdom and other democracies in Europe and in Indo-Pacific. So those are some of the things that we would undertake immediately in order to defend our interests and project our values.
We've had a good question come in from Rakesh David. His question is, do you believe that the UN Security Council can still be effective when countries like China and Russia, who hold veto power, are the same ones that are involved in many of the conflicts that come before the UN security?
Well, that's a great question. I think, Canada is a small country on the world stage, and reform of the United Nations is something well beyond the capacity of a country like Canada to undertake on its own. I think the UN is clearly in need of some reform, particularly as it relates to some of the issues you brought up, but also as it relates to some of the corruption that we've seen in recent years. But I really think that this is something that has to be driven by great powers, because ultimately Canada, being a small country of some 37 million citizens, simply doesn't have the capacity to undertake something of that scale. I think our efforts are better focused on working with allies to reform institutions like the World Health Organization, like the World Trade Organization, reinvigorating the Commonwealth and the Francophonie. I think that's where our efforts are best put, because we are of a scale that we could meaningfully contribute to the efforts for the reform of those institutions.
We've had another question from Samuel Ennis, who's asked about trade opportunities for Canada and UK arising out of Brexit.
Yeah, there's an interim trade agreement currently in place. We expect that at some point it will be replaced by a permanent agreement. Canada and the UK have a strong trading relationship, and even more, a strong investment relationship and two-way investment. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be able to achieve a trade agreement that mirrors a lot of what was negotiated in the Canada-European Union trade agreement. So I'm hopeful that that will come to pass in the next year or so, and that we can continue to grow bilateral trade and investment.
Thank you for your time today, Michael. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully we can do this again someday in person, maybe in Canada or in the UK. I'll pass it over to Paul.
Just want to echo that. Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining. Our next event is next week on Tuesday, I believe, with Judith Collins, the leader of the New Zealand National Party. So we'll be able to get a New Zealand perspective of a lot of similar issues, I imagine. But thank you once again, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining.
My pleasure, Paul. My pleasure, Sunil. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you.